Hello, everyone, and welcome back again to the MUTEK Recorder. My name is Claire L. Evans. I'm a writer and musician based in Los Angeles, which, beyond being the city of asphalt, dreams, and illusions, remains forever the unceded ancestral indigenous lands of the Chumash and Tongva peoples. I'm your host for this ad hoc variety half hour, here in person with you every day at the end of the forum proceedings to recap and discuss what we've seen today. But there is so much else left to explore beyond this screen. My colleagues over at Holo magazine are working around the clock and behind the scenes, deeply absorbing the conversations that are flying around this forum every morning and exploring every nuance as they post in real time an evolving living document in dossier form on the Holo magazine website. So every day they're watching all the panels and pulling out all the gems, images, references, key takeaways, links for further learning, the whole nine, archiving simultaneously and experiencing the forum as it happens. Every day, my role is to come in here and share with you some highlights from that evolving dossier, but I hope that you take the time to browse it on your own time because there's lots there, and Greg and Alexander from HoloMag are out here making detailed hypertextual footnotes for your enjoyment. I guarantee you will discover something that you missed or something that you want to explore further. We are now halfway through this experiment, this hybrid live stream / publishing sprint experiment that we're calling the MUTEK Recorder. Yesterday, we were joined on this program by Samane Moafi, who shared some highlights of her practice as a forensic architect. Every day, we'll be joined by a different special guest who will share their experience and their interpretation of what recording means to them in their practice. If you're just joining us for the first time, no sweat. It's kind of like planting a tree. The best time to do it is 10 years ago or right now. Before we get to today's guest, let's take a little bit of a look at the dossier and reflect on some highlights of the forum today. Now, we started our conversation today with a convo between Tina Blakely of Blakewell Studio and Ryan Howard of Google, talking about physical experiential design in our post-pandemic era. I enjoyed soaking up what was clearly a deeply impassioned and granular meeting of minds about this changing culture field, the challenges it faces, and the ways it has begun to embrace audience or user journey as a framing principle. At one point during the conversation, Howard noted that a baseline problem that we are always trying to solve is that there are screens everywhere in the world of myriad sizes and aspect ratios. How do you create content that works in all those contexts? And how do we free content from the web browser and bring it to multiple contexts? A problem that many of us are grappling with. And further, I might add, how do you create content that bridges the screen and the IRL? This sparked a thought for me, and it might be tangential, but I want to share a little bit of an anecdote. When I was writing my book, Broadband, which is a feminist history of computing, plug, I profiled a group of women who built one of the earliest online services for women, a first-class BBS community called Women's Wire, which became women.com in the early 90s. And there was a tension within that group early on during this very key moment of transition between the early era of dial-up services, listservs, message boards, and the dawn of the World Wide Web. It was an important transitional moment, of course, for a lot of people. But what they couldn't agree on during this moment was what the internet was for. Was it an information resource, i.e. a place where someone could go and get stock updates or weather updates, something along those lines, do research? Or was it an exchange, a place where people got together to exchange ideas and experiences? Choosing a side between those two poles seemed to be a very important thing at the time in terms of creating a coherent business plan. But it was a very heated debate. And one member of the team told me something which has really stuck with me and which I often come back to, which is that at a certain level of intensity in any either or argument, the fact that it has reached that intensity is an indicator that the correct answer is and. And I think when we're talking about bridging between screens, between formats, between meat space and cyberspace, we got to keep that in mind, that we are long past the era of either or. The answer is always and. and is fertile, right? We're inhabiting a great big and right now in this whole forum, which exists everywhere and nowhere at once. Speaking of everywhere and nowhere, the second panel that we followed closely today was the discussion about artificial intelligence, the sort of wide-ranging exploration of the question of autonomy and intention in art and AI. And I, for one, am just thrilled that this conversation was happening. I think this question of intent is so key and is often ignored. I think in a lot of the discourse around art and AI, at least in the media, it's attempted to frame the AI itself as the agent of creativity, rather than a tool through which artists are exploring and expanding upon their own perceptions and abilities, or just sort of generally widening the semantic space in which they work. Like, there's been so much of, gee, we fed an AI all this normal stuff, and then it spat out all this wacky stuff, and it sold for a lot of money, but is it art? And I think this whole question, this whole framing is so boring and reductive. There seems to be almost a fetish for talking about these things in the context of these kind of clear definitional framings. Is it art? Does it have value? Or in the context of automation and displacement, which seems to imply to me that it's somehow easier to make art using AI than it is to make art using traditional methods. And anyone who's worked with machine learning, and I'm sure there's many of you in the audience today, knows that that is definitely not the case. It's quite a slog. And all that being said, I'm all for the thought experiment of trying to appreciate the output of any AI system or machine learning model kind of on its own terms, aesthetically on its own merit. Maybe it even helps us to decenter our, anthropogenic human perspective, to sit with this kind of garbled, often sort of unreal stuff and kind of get down with it on a formal level. But if I've learned anything from my work and my research, sort of looking into the history of computation and the ways in which we have kind of narrativized and experienced that history, it's that when it comes to any exciting new technology, specifically computational technologies, we have this almost uncanny, highly self-defeating ability to gloss over the human in the loop if they are standing in the way of a good story, right? And that always causes harm. Not to get too, cardigan with elbow patches on, but I'm thinking about the very first time that the media, the press, reported about the ENIAC computer, which was the first programmable electronic computer. The New York Times wrote a piece about it, which was essentially the first piece of media about a computer that was published after all these machines began to be declassified after the Second World War. And it was obviously a hugely novel thing to encounter a machine like this. And everyone was so seduced by the idea of a giant electronic brain that they kind of completely ignored the fact that the giant electronic brain was essentially useless. It was a piece of furniture, were it not for the many, many weeks of labor that went into defining the problems, creating a program, and then physically feeding that program really bite by bite into the machine, then running it repeatedly, debugging it and cross-checking, all of that other stuff. And the consequence of that was that we sort of lost and forgot the early history of programming for a generation, which ultimately resulted in the kind of highly, the boys club environment of Silicon Valley that we are kind of dealing with the consequences of today. So it's a bad thing to ignore the human in the loop. And the media, all of us really, are not much better at that now, right? There's this same notion that lingers with AI, that this technology is neutral and autonomous and infallible, which is huge yikes for me. So I really, really appreciate artists pushing against this conception. I think artists have an enormous role to play here, both in pushing the technology forward and in being very clear about the labor, the thought, the intention, and the larger context that surrounds work produced entirely or with the assistance of AI technologies and machine learning technologies. As Maya Ganesh said during the panel, there's always a shadow human in the loop. So where are they? What was their intention? Who are they? What are they trying to say? What are their biases? What are they missing? In my own work with machine learning, I've always found that it's useful to think of the output of these models as being the beginning of a process rather than the end, or perhaps a waypoint between two processes, but certainly not an end in itself. I think the output of a machine learning model can be used very effectively as a provocation or a prompt, but it's not always legible on its own. Our job as artists is to reconstruct something meaningful from sometimes the quite fragmentary and weird output, to give it order and purpose, to put it into context, to convincingly kind of inhabit it until it becomes our own. I believe strongly that art is the work of making meaning, and no matter what the starting point is, that action kind of has to remain the same, and we can't absolve ourselves of that responsibility. I also wanted to shout out really quickly what I thought was another really important and great point made in this panel, also made by Maya Ganesh, which is the idea that autonomy itself is kind of a problematic thing. It doesn't reflect the true nature of things, right? Because we as humans are not autonomous in any way. We live in complex, interdependent societies, which themselves rely on complex, interdependent ecological systems, fragile as they are. And we should never think of ourselves as being alone. And we should certainly not teach machines that they are alone either. Which reminds me that I am not alone in this stream today. With me is my special guest for the day, Dorothy Santos. How about that segue? Dorothy is a prolific writer, artist, and educator whose radar sweeps critical media anthropology, computational media, technology, race, and ethics, and as I just discovered from some online lurking, tarot, ritual, and science fiction and fantasy, which I'm so down with. Dorothy is the executive director of the Processing Foundation, whose aim is to promote software literacy within the visual arts and visual literacy within technology. So binary smashing, boundary smashing, essential. Processing just celebrated 20 years, so claps on that. Dorothy, I'm thrilled to have you here. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Claire, for that lovely introduction. And yes, I'm actually happy that you included the tarot in there as well. So I really am looking forward to the conversation. So I think what would be best, I'm not presenting any slides. I'm actually just talking a little bit about my kind of how I ended up at Processing Foundation, because I think a lot of people wonder, I'm not a coder. So let's dispel that. I think a lot of people have an assumption that I studied computer science and that I am a programmer, I'm a coder. I have very novice skills, but I have been writing about and thinking about new media and digital art and whatever people want or are comfortable saying, generative art, algorithmic, computational media, etc. I've been covering that for a while. So I've been doing art criticism for a little over a decade, but at the same time, I was working in biotech at the same time. So there's a whole lot there. And doing film and digital media, and I'm focused also, as I mentioned, on computational media. But my work with Processing Foundation started, and because the theme is recording, I probably should put this on the record, is I remember first meeting Casey Rees at the Creators Project, and it was back in 2011. He actually led a drawing workshop, and you didn't need to bring a laptop. There was no need. He just wanted you and paper and pens, and he really kind of went over some of the aspects that inspired him and Ben Fry to create processing and the community. And I was stuck. I was stuck at that time. I was just kind of in awe of having met him. And I remember the first thing I said to him was, "Oh my God, you're Casey Rees." And he just smiled and looked at me and said, "Yes, I am." And little did I know that 10 years later, I would actually be working closely with, Casey and Lauren Lee McCarthy, Dan Schiffman, Saber Khan, Joanna Hedva, Cassie Tarakajian, Evelyn Meso, Shinchen Ye, that's the processing team. And our board and advisors, we constantly are working on how do we actually record? We may not call it recording, but how do we document along the way the evolution of the different programming languages in addition to processing, P5.js, and, what it means to actually, be stewards. So, some of my work in other areas of my life, such as I teach right now at San Jose State University, and I'm part of an initiative right now that is about digital stewardship and archiving. And what does it look like to, if we have VR projects, XR projects, AR, we're thinking about that through the lens of, education, but also for the greater community. I'm also involved at UC Santa Cruz, which is where I'm a PhD candidate in film and digital media. I'm, working with the Center for Open Source Software and how different types of open source projects can be supported hereafter, because we're in this, it's a really fascinating space to be in right now, because with the pandemic and having to reconfigure and adjust in accordance to these conditions of the, political, cultural conditions we're in, how do we steward these projects and prepare for all that? Those are some of the things that are on my mind right now. I think also in terms of my own research and my own projects, because I don't want to take too much time, and I want to step into a conversation with you, Claire. One of my favorite scholars, Halcyon M. Lawrence, who talks about speech and usability of voice recognition, because my dissertation is actually on speech and voice recognition and assistive tech. And when we think about what is the voice of the future, literally, and those are the things that I'm exploring in my own practice, both creative and academic writing, and creative writing as well. And a lot of that ties to the open source software works and projects that we support at Processing Foundation. And to tie it back to what Halcyon M. Lawrence is talking about in the book, Your Computer's on Fire, in her essay, Siri Disciplines, one of the things that she talks about, because she offers up this, speculation of the future, is, a lot of that is held within open source software and what people do with those projects. And, how do you talk about ethics and, race and gender and class within those, within kind of the framing of a space that's historically, experimental. And so I really love how that's kind of tied into the work that I'm doing at Processing and beyond, and the ways that I'm thinking about, the work we're doing and how we record, and how we document, which is, for me, my preferable mode of recording is actually voice. I love listening to people's voices, and I love being in conversation. And I think this is actually a really great, I guess, segue to our conversation. I could talk a little bit more, but I feel that's more important, to be in conversation with you.
I love that. Okay, thank you. I love that you opened with this caveat that you're not a coder, because I often do the same thing when I give presentations, especially to technical audiences. I feel like I have to be like, don't worry, everyone, I'm not a coder, or don't expect too much of me, I'm not a coder. I'm trying to undo that impulse, because it feels defensive to me, but at the same time kind of necessary in terms of like positioning my perspective. So I don't know, I'm just curious, like, how not being a coder has been an asset to you actually in the work that you do.
I think a lot of it, I can step back. I think also because I don't want to be too formal, but because I am trained technically in visual and critical studies, I know how to look at work, say what I see, draw different kind of throughways and meanings that other people may not, sometimes, in some cases, people are very much in the thick of it. So they're really heads down, working in the code base, and which is great. And that's not to say that, that there's value in every, aspect of artwork and art practices. But I think with me, I love the fact that I can, have these conversations and say, oh, there's another artist that, or a composer or a writer that was looking at the same idea that you're kind of exploring in your particular library, for instance, or, some aspect of what you want to add, for instance, to a code base. Have you seen these other individuals that have done that? And I think, admittedly, that's why I'm in education. Once I learn something, I really want to just share it with students and say, oh my gosh, there's someone doing this work. You said you wanted to do that. Let's figure out a way to do it. And if I can't help you technically, maybe at the conceptual level, we can build the story together. I mean, I do teach in digital media arts at San Jose, as I mentioned, at San Jose State. And I think a lot of the students, I didn't realize how much that they were craving. I teach storytelling and social documentation. And so we do it through all of these different modalities. And I'm showing them different artists who have done it through coding, voice, sonic sculptures, playable media. Those are the types of things that I feel are very valuable as someone who is a non-coder, and it took me a long time to do something very similar to what you mentioned, I really want to say I stopped really devaluing that part of my practice and who I am, because I think we already live in a world where people tell you need to learn XYZ skills to be successful, but we ourselves don't even know what that means. And we certainly, in this kind of era that we're living in right now, especially with all of the, cultural and social uprisings of last year and, the pandemic, it's very clear things need to change. So I kind of feel like in the past year and a half, I've really dispelled that for myself.
Yeah, I think also just what our definitions of success are so subjective too, and so specific to the individual. I'm the same way. Like I do see it as an asset. I mean, of course, it would be great if I also, like had this whole other part of my brain that I could just dig and actually build things on my own. But I actually like being kind of, as an artist who's interested in technology, sort of forced to work with other people. I mean, there is an element of, if we're all these completely autonomous builders of machines, then we have nothing to share with anybody else. And I get so much out of the back and forth between people who have different disciplines, different backgrounds, different practices, making something together. And then, because that thing is always greater than the sum of its parts, and it always evolves in really interesting ways. I, for one, am really grateful for those conversations. And I think that especially when in the past, when I've worked with people who would sort of self-define as being coders or as being kind of on the technical side, I mean, they get a lot out of it too. I hope they get a lot out of it too. I think artists ask questions that other people don't ask. I have a memory of working on a AI music project and talking with like these research scientists who were working on machine learning and music, and we were having this conversation about what it meant to create something that was good. Like, because you build an AI model and then you have this output, and it's like, okay, ideally you would refine from that output. You would take the things that were good from that output, feed it back into the system in order to refine the system and consistently make good output. But then how do you define what's good when you're talking about making something musical? Does that mean that it's something that's going to be commercially successful, something that's going to like really blow the mind of some teenager in their basement somewhere? I mean, there's such a wide interpretation of good. And in my experience as a consumer of art and music, like sometimes that means things that are difficult or challenging or whatever. And I remember we kind of came to this crossroads where the engineers were like, well, we'll just upload all of these audio, output, these MIDI files onto SoundCloud, and the ones that get the most streams, those will be the good ones, and we'll put those back into the system. It was like, oh God, no, that's not how I think about good. So, even just like basic sort of definitions of how we determine what's worthwhile, what has value, what's worth exploring further. All of these things get messy, and I love that. I love that conversation, that messiness. Another thing you mentioned during your brief but wonderful talk was the work of being a steward, which I think is something that is really so vital and also so undervalued. How important it is to hold on to, document, preserve, and make space for all the things that are being produced now. But I often wonder, I guess, like when we document in general, let's just go there. Who are we documenting for and when? Because sometimes I think we have a hard time knowing what is valuable about the things that surround us because we're so close to them. And I don't know, I just think about like as doing historical research, like looking at things, sometimes it's very hard to find the things that I specifically am looking for because the people at the time didn't think those things were important. For example, the early web, like it's basically just broken in fragments and, barely remembered because nobody at the time was really thinking about how important the feature. So yeah, I don't know. It's not really a question, it's sort of an unformed thought, but about like documentation and time, and how we know how to select what is important and preserve what is important.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also depends on, kind of what is the kind of cultural environment, what is the environment that someone is based within. I think one of the things that I thought about was, I'm not sure if you've read The Shell Game by Kim Adrian. It's an anthology of experimental prose and poetry. And one of the poems in there, I think it is called marriage.exe. So it simulates the coding. The interface is that of coding. So when you look, or a programming language, it suggests a programming language. And one of my mentors, Nancy Chen, who is a medical anthropologist, described my practice as subversion as methodology, because that's what I do in my own creative practice. Is I take one of the projects I'm working on as a part of my dissertation work is I'm actually subverting the clinical trial protocol. So when you look at it, it kind of looks like, okay, it's scientific documentation, that's great. And then, but you read closely and you're like, oh, this is interactive fiction. Oh, can I really call this number? And then you call it and then, oh, it's me. That's a project I'm working on right now. It's tentatively, the working title is called Do No Harm. But it's a way for me to record my understanding, my observations of when I was in biotech, but also how, different types of infrastructures work within healthcare. I think something else that you talked about, that actually, to circle it back around to, the poem and the anthology, The Shell Game, is that very subversion of forms that we know. And when you read this poem, and I have the book, I wish I actually pulled it out because I forgot I actually should probably, speak to the author's name. But when you read it and you kind of feel, the kind of instantaneous reaction a reader might have is, well, this looks like code. Why would I read this? Would I even understand it? And then you start to read the actual text and you realize, oh, wow, the procedural aspects of code can also be applied to a marriage. And so when you read the poem, it starts to sink in, like, oh my gosh, that's the command line for take out the garbage. That's the command line for pick up the kids. It's like this real, the Shell Game, I highly recommend it because it really forces you to look at things that you're so used to, whether it's a contract, whether it's game instructions, whether it's, technical instructions, but it's writers and novelists that have taken that form and subverted it. And that to me is one of my favorite forms of documentation and recording is, and Ruha Benjamin talks about that in, one of her essays of, where she's talking about informed dissent. What if we have all the information we need, but there's a different way? There's a different way to world build. And a lot of that is done through science fiction and, fantasy. And how come that can't be done in programming? We see that in processing in P5.js. We see so many artists within the community making, not just visual art, but also sound work and, platforms to compose and to, capture different, sounds and experiences. It's just, I think that's one of the reasons why I love processing. I am probably, sometimes I feel I'm the biggest cheerleader for processing than maybe, than some of the folks involved, because it's, but we're all cheerleaders, but I think what I'm trying to get at is my excitement for the future really does kind of lie in the work I'm doing through the organization. And I do try to fit it into my own, practices as a writer. It really does help me understand better new media and digital art and different aspects of how we can change for the better and for artists and be there for artists, and kind of pushing forward the work that they do.
That's beautiful. I wish I want to ask you like 10,000 more questions about science fiction specifically, but we are coming up against time. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real treat. Everyone, this weekend we are taking a break from all of this deep thinking, but we'll be back on Monday to kick off another live week of documentia, synthesis, and conversation. We have a lot of great guests lined up for you on the recorder, so please tune in if you want to peek behind the veil of the working processes of folks like Tim Mon, Benjamin Bratton, Xiaowei Wang, and Jörg Lenny. Until then, enjoy the weekend, and I will see you next week. Bye, everyone.